では次のご発表、相原さん。
Now, next presentation will be given by Ms. AIHARA. Her presentation title is Who Judges and Who Forgives.
はい、皆様こんにちは。おはよう。
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for your valuable time on this third day of the symposium. My biography and CV is in the brochure, so I'd like to skip over that. The title of my presentation is Who Judges and Who Forgives? Kimin, Upstanders or Uprisers Overcoming Gaps in Dialogue. I would rather use the word upstanders. But the Japanese translation, kimin, is something that is often said and spoken in Fukushima. People of Fukushima consider kimin themselves kimin. Originally, the Chinese character has been different. Kimin as an abandoned people. They were internally speaking themselves as kimin or the abandoned people. But now I have changed the Chinese character to upstanders, the rising people. This, in a way, I believe, the fact that they are courageous enough to talk about themselves as the abandoned people are, in a way, an act of upstanding or uprising. That is why I have changed the Chinese character to talk about kimin or upstanders. In Olga's discussion, she was talking about the invisible situation of invisibility. That was a characteristic of the nuclear power plant accident situation. As I am the journalist, my work is to report on what is invisible, to try to communicate that to the public. As journalists, people's words or acts, what do they represent? What are made invisible are the topics of my reporting and investigation. As one journalist, I have been active in this sphere, so I would like to talk about these examples as I speak. Now, when you think about radiation issue, we talk about the much concerned health impact. When it comes to the connection and the bridges between the people's everyday life and the world of medicine, there is this certain gap, and that is where the question is rising. So in that sense, I'd like to talk very briefly about the medical ethics. And in that sense, when we look back in history, there has been many issues, ethical issues, in terms of investigations, searches, and studies of so-called human testing. The citizens, experts, doctors. When we look at these parties, there are certain and considerable gap in information. In expert field of medicine, there is an absolute asymmetry in terms of information if you compare that to the ordinary citizens. And that actually clarifies the various issues and problems. For example, during the times of war in Japan, human testing has been conducted in Manchuria, in China, and in Europe. The Auschwitz was a known name for the place of mass murder, massacre, and human testing by the Nazis, Germany. And during the Nuremberg trial, the issue of the doctors and medical experts taking part in such criminal acts was a major focus. But in the way, there has been atoned or forgiven. But now in Japan, going back to Japan, there was the so-called Unit 731, who were the units of the Japanese army back at the time of the wars who were undertaking plutonium testing on humans. And there was also a societal issue in Japan about 20 years ago of the medical disaster caused by the AIDS drug inflicted by a pharmaceutical company, creating a truly a huge amount of scandal in Japan. And another example is the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, a very well-known experiment that was conducted by the U.S. government agency in order to understand the impact of syphilis. So that was the research. They pretended that they were treating these patients, but they actually did not offer any treatment. The research topic was what happens if you leave syphilis unattended. This has led to the medical neglect. Sometimes the research took place on the theme of medical neglect. This has, of course, caused a societal havoc in the U.S. And during the time of Clinton administration, there was finally an official apology by former President Clinton. And the background to these issues is the relationship between the patient and the doctors. What has been the agreement or the lack of agreement or consent between these two parties in the history in our society? Now, so we need to think about the next question. What is the principal bearer of medicine? The principal character, rather, is the citizens, the patients, the citizens, because when it comes to medicine, when it comes to suffering, pain, treatment, the recipient of all these phenomena are patients. So this concept of who is the principal recipient and beneficiary of medicine and various services, be it good or bad, are at the end of the day patients like ourselves. That perspective is important. And in that sense, when we look back at the current situation of radiation contamination after the NPP accident, who are the major recipient, the main recipient on which these afflictions are caused? So this is the perspective that we should not forget. Well, now, we need to look back at the real the basics of why doctors are allowed to treat in the first place. There are laws that provide special privileges to medical experts and doctors through training and expert education that they receive and the knowledge that they have accumulated, so that the doctors are allowed to provide treatments or certain actions that impact human body. For example, surgery using knives and surgical tools that cuts open people's skins and cause blood to flow. The fact that doctors are allowed is because they are privileged because of their training and their knowledge of safety and sufficient knowledge in the field. And that, in a way, is the medical license that provides such privilege within the legal context. Next point I'd like to talk about is the word beyond to err is human. In U.S., there are 90,000 cases of medical accidents every year. That was the case about 16 years ago, and that was much talked about in the United States back then. So how should we think about medicine under such circumstances? The Institute of Medicine in the USA has published a book called Beyond to Err is Human in 1999. The title indicates that on the basis, there is a concept of humans prone to making mistakes coming from the British poet's word from the 18th century, Alexander Pope. And that leads to the issue of paternalism and informed consent. Very briefly, I'd like to talk about this as well. In the book by the Institute of Medicine, it is stated that the decision-making power and discretion of the doctors are sometimes exercised in certain circumstances, but in other cases, there is a strong necessity of informed consent and consentment between the giver and recipient of these medical services. When it comes to the accident, the time of emergency, that's the situation when the strong medical discretion is necessary or is exercised, and that is the initial stage after the accident or emergency situations. And so in certain cases, some people believe from ethical point of view that such medical discretion should not be exercised. Some people believe that it should be exercised, but in any case, that is exercised. And after that, there is a next stage of unofficial participation by patients in decision making. That is followed by another stage of official participation by patient, and patient more proactively participating in the decision making of their treatment choices, for example. And that is followed by updating, in a way, of the medical side, medical discretion, updating the medical knowledge, the training. So in that way, this is a positive cycle or ideal cycle, in a way, of updating medical discretion. But however, when there are wars, nuclear power plant accident, and other emergency, the paternalism is exercised. But in any case, I believe that paternalism should be exercised in a limited manner, only in these circumstances. The Disaster Utopia is a work of an author that I like to talk about. The lack of the existence of chaos and that creates a situation when the citizens or the ordinary public could be prone to attacks, and under that circumstances, the actions by individuals, even though they are the result of the decision making by the individuals, under such circumstances, it could be blamed as something else, and it could be categorized or interpreted as the lack of order or creation of disorder. So in that way, there is a additional pressure under such circumstances of emergency, of trying to control the people's actions in order to eliminate such disorder. Well, going back, how can we make something that is invisible visible? How can we do that with words? Well, let us look at and listen to the voices of the people who were exposed to radiation. Mr. Sato from Itate Village Assembly recently said to me that they feel like they're treated like guinea pigs. That's a very recent comment of his. Various researchers and research groups are coming to Itate, but at the end of the day, they have no guidance as to concrete actions they could take, the concrete measures that they could take for their future. That has been the case for the past 4 years for the people of Itate. Now, the medical shock doctrine is an issue, using words of safety and relief, but looking back in the history, it has already happened in the Marshall Islands in terms of the atomic testing and human testing that was conducted by the USA. That was also a case of medical shock doctrine. As long as the action contributes to the medical world, That doctrine was that convincing of the citizens and the subjects that it contributes to the medical world. But at the end of the day, it was nothing more than human testing. Tani-san, who has self-evacuated, Tanji-san, who has evacuated to Okayama, said that our confident words that tell about the future can be the base of post-nuclear accident Japan's new legal system. That's another important word. Now, let us give us some concrete examples. We have a really huge argument yesterday, that is risk communication, post-nuclear power plant accident. So-called experts behave how and what kind of explanation they actually give. I'd like to share one example of such. At the beginning of this year, there was a Fukushima glass dosimeter briefing conducted in Fukushima City. Together with Dr. Shimizu, I attended this briefing with glass badge. Please take a look at Dr. Shimizu, who hangs down the glass dosimeter from his neck, and this is a dosimeter given to the volunteers of Fukushima citizens. And they have to express their intention to be taking part in this initiative to get the measurement. And then you see the political elements in this briefing, because the contents of a briefing meeting included the political aspects. For instance, the empirical or experience of citizens are different from what the lecturers said in the briefing. In addition to that, how political decisions were made, those important issues were not so explicit from the participants. After the measurement completed by using a glass dosimeter, then those who participated, this is for the Fukushima City citizens, conducted by Fukushima municipal government. It's hard to see, however, those who attended received this kind of briefing or explanation. What it says that the fallout comes and it can contaminate the environment. By taking this kind of a picture, the briefing explained that mechanism. On the left-hand side, you can see the NPP. And then on the left-hand side, this picture of NPP is different from the Fukushima Daiichi NPP. So the structures are different. At any rate, the accident happens at the NPP. However, you see this NPP is under the usual operation. At any rate, it says that the fallout comes down. It says the radioactive cloud carried by the wind. And you see this cloud comes over the heads of child and mother playing in the park. And then happy and smiley were radioactive. However, if the rains and snowfalls happen, then fallout comes down to the ground. This means the outside exposure, experts and the causers, or the person who caused this problem, as well as the government officials, are not existed in this picture. However, this is the way Fukushima City explained. Even immediately after the NPP accident, they play around. However, it doesn't happen actually. The water supply disrupted and the blackout happened immediately after the accident. And therefore, there are long queue made in front of the water supply vehicle. In addition to that, they were ordered to keep inside the house because of the government announcement. Therefore, it's really rare to see such a really smiley faces. And then if you move on to the next slide, it says that once the radioactive cloud goes away, doses go down. However, actually, even after the radioactive cloud goes away, because there's a radioactive nuclides remain, which contaminated the soil, even after 4 years or 5 years after the accident, still contamination remains.
However, what officials said at the seminar is different from what actually happened, as you see here. If you move on to the next slide, again in the same briefing meeting, one person asked, wearing the mask, I heard cesium was detected, meaning that I may inhale that. What this girl asks is about the internal exposure. However, the doctor answered to this girl saying that even if you breathe an outdoor air, then in that village for a year, the exposure to the radiation would be 1/10 of what you'd get from getting a chest X-ray, and therefore this doctor mixed up with the external exposure and internal exposure, and her explanation is totally incorrect or inaccurate. And then another explanation, another slide. This is another slide they used. This yellow dot in the center represents organ, and the accuracy of the glass dosimeter is explained and this schematics. However, for us, general public, we don't want to listen to the accuracy of the glass dosimeter. Of course, this is one of them. However, it's not what we really want to see. What we really want to know is how we can avoid exposure to the radiation. However, at any rate, it says that as to the exposure of the organ, the radiation comes outside the body, can be prevented by our body, and therefore, when you think about radiation damage, the glass dosimeter that can take a look at the individual dose is better, and therefore the question and answers are totally inagreeable. And then if you move on to the next slide, the lecturer asked the audience, raise your hand if you believe how many people got the cancer in Japan recently. 1 in 10, 1 in 5, and 1 in 2. These are the options. And actually, if you think about cancer, the smoking is more hazardous to our body. And actually, the same question was raised by one of the leading insurance companies, AFLAC, and actually it said that 1 out of 2 develop cancer in their lifetime. However, they be careful about wording. It says that 1 out of 2 people may develop in their life, meaning that assumptions are different between AFLAC explanation and the Fukushima City explanation. Take different assumptions. If you go back to the Fukushima City explanation, it says that recently in Japan, and then if this is true, the 50% of this room may develop cancer at any rate. Assumptions are different, and without noticing for us, assumptions are changed, as Cecilia mentioned. Because she covered this, therefore I'm going to skip them because of the time limited. I'm going to go to the summary paper of mine. There is the Fukushima citizens health checkup, and this include many issues, and therefore I'd like to cover them in the following round table session. There's the survey data under the order of Fukushima prefectural government, and under this order, the Fukushima Medical University doctors made the papers. However, this caused many arguments, and therefore I'd like to share those arguments in the following round table session. Now, lastly, I'd like to talk about who judges and who forgives, because this is an invisible issue, and the invisible thing should be resided by the God. Anything unknown to us and anything too sophisticated for lowly human being to understand, that is under the jurisdiction of the God. And by using this argument, everything gets blurred. However, even in the ongoing stage, there are many health issues, not only in Fukushima prefecture, but also the entire East Japan, and they are threatened of having health problems at any rate. And therefore, what is the problem, especially who judges and who forgives? That is what we have to consider in the future. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Thank you very much, Ms. AIHARA. Just like in the previous presentation, in your presentation this time, clarification of facts is very important because there are, however, just like in the previous session, if you need to confirm something to clarify the facts, please raise those confirmatory questions right now. I have additional information, just in short. Yesterday, Dr. Otsuru of the Fukushima Medical University, he has prepared a slide. And as to this slide, who is the audience for that? Aizu, Wakamatsu, Koriyama, Iwaki City, Heisei 27, the radiation, the seminars, doctors. And this is for the medical associations, and the threshold is above 100 millisievert. And what's meticulous about this slide is that if you refer to the summary sheet or summary section, the threshold for the fetus is 100 millisievert. It makes sure that even for fetus and the womb, the threshold is 100 millisievert. And then in June, ICRP meeting, there's nobody saying that in Fukushima Prefecture, and I was scolded because I said such a remark at ICRP meeting. Regardless of that, Dr. Otsuru of Fukushima Medical University still says this, 100. There are many things we have to do to tackle the issues of Fukushima, and there are many issues we have to take action immediately, especially this should be the issue that we have to work on with the sense of urgency. Dr. Shimizu, as another committee member, should raise this as a problem. And therefore, in the Constellation meeting, I want you, Dr. Shimizu, to point this out as a problem. And if you need help and assistance, I'm happy to go with you, Dr. Shimizu, because Dr. Shimizu can talk about as an independent scientist at any rate. Please make sure to point this out as wrong information, and because of this information, many actions are prevented. Thank you very much. And I'd like to cover your topic in the following roundtable session. In a closed society, there is a norm or so-called common sense. However, in the different situation, or if you take the bigger viewpoint or context, that can be the broader issues. And it's hard to correct it, and it's hard for you to criticize it under circumstances, under certain circumstances. In addition to that, we have to take a look at the gap between what experts say and what the citizens say. And it's very difficult, and that we don't see any transition to improve this situation. That is the current state in Japan in many senses. I believe mass media has to work here more, or there should be some bridge or mediator anchor to connect general public and experts, because now we have to remove the boundaries or the barriers of the dialogue between the experts and citizens. And if there are any hindrance of such discussion, we have to put such person or the organizations in the stage, on the spotlight. Thank you very much for pointing out very important points. The core of the scientific matter was followed by Dr. Tsuda, but I believe there are something we can see in the relationships between the doctor and the patient. I believe there are some questions, but can I move on to the next presentation?
Is that okay? Then once again, thank you very much, Ms. AIHARA. And I'm happy to receive any of your questions or comments later at the roundtable discussion this afternoon.